There's something that bugs me about plants that have berry in the name.
This is how you're starting this? Wait, sorry, tell me that one more time.
Plants that have berry in the name.
Okay.
So, like, today we're talking about elderberry. In Europe, it was called like the elder tree, but it's not like a universal rule, right? Like, you don't call blueberry the blue bush, right? Like the elder
Yeah, okay.
tree.
I kind of get what you're saying. Like, I wouldn't call it a rasp bush, but would rasp what makes the P silent?
Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac, where we ask the tough questions.
Ask questions. That's for sure tough. Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, you don't have an answer for the silent P.
I don't.
Yeah. All right. So they're not that easy.
It's a real stumper.
Yeah. That Pinus stumper. It's an inside joke. Don't ask questions.
Just between us two. You wouldn't get it,
Between
listener.
us and your Pinus.
Ugh.
Okay. So today we were talking about elderberry, as I've mentioned at this point. So everyone's probably familiar, at least with the elderberry as like a thing that exists on the earth, right? It's a woody perennial that's native to both North America and Europe as two separate species, despite some people's best efforts. Both have been used for similar purposes across the globe, but looking at like historical evidence, aka like when I was digging through academic research and old books and all that fun stuff that I like to do in my free time, a lot more has been written about the European elderberry as opposed to the American.
Because of course.
Because, of course. Now, that said, the American offers some unique properties that are worth exploring and making a point to care about as people living in North America, where it has thrived in the landscape despite aggressive invasive species pressure. So, there's that.
Yeah, I mean it does seem like one of those natives that's like really good at just surviving on like a side of a highway and stuff like that. Just growing in the cracks.
Yeah, you'll like be driving down the highway in the late spring and you'll just see these big white balloons and you're like, what the hell is that? Congratulations. If you live like in the Northeast, especially, probably an elderberry. So like that's cool to be like, oh, there's some elderberries. And then you see like the black locust blooms come out and you're like, oh no, they've made it. The invasives, they're here. Whereas if you live someplace where they are naturalized, then you don't think that. But here in Massachusetts, it's like the horror sets in.
When isn't the horror setting in, Andy, in Massachusetts?
This is true.
I
I
feel like
mean,
that's a year round.
you you may not know this, people, but it is the night before the election, and for some reason we're like, we need to talk about
I
elderberries.
mean,
So speaking of the horrors, we're living it.
this is pretty critical stuff.
This is when
You're not getting this sort of election coverage on your everyday podcast.
you're not, and you guys already know the results. So we're just like driving you blind while you already know the results. The worst kind of
We
coverage.
won't know the
It's like
results.
watching the news after the election, right? Like watching them talk about projections and stuff, but like the election happened 6 months ago.
Mhm.
That's what we're doing right here.
And you're being pretty optimistic. We're not gonna have any results for
Reading
months.
the elderberry seeds over here. We should have done an election episode, huh? We did it 4 years ago, election predictions. I don't think you were on the podcast at the time. It was me and Elliot.
Yeah,
But we did one and I was eerily right because I was like, this is what's going to happen. And then like January 6th happened and
and it's like,
it
oh,
didn't get better from there.
yeah.
Anyways, you can read all about the fortunes of the future by looking into elderberry seeds. That's not actually true, and that's not based on any history or
And it's
anything.
fake news.
But I'm trying to get us back on tack. Yeah, it's fake news. All news is fake news when you're me, I guess. I don't know.
When you're fake as fuck.
When you're fake as fuck, yes. Now, the American elderberry is basically across most of the continent, right? And the fact that it is basically across most of the continent seems to be linked to the fact that it is very cold resistant. And during the Younger Dryas, the Ice Age and all that fun stuff, it continued to spread across the continent when like not many other plants could. So it really like built itself a nice little base in North America. And to that point, like the American elderberry, it has like a ridiculous range. It's from zone 2 to zone 10. So you can grow it in like mid-northern Canada to Florida, which like, I don't know,
Hell of a range.
hell of a range. Move over Mariah Carey, that's a hell of a range.
Nice.
Nice. The elderberry, as I'd mentioned, has a lot of, or the American elderberry rather, shares a lot with the European in the sense that it was prized food, it was medicine, and it's got all this really great stuff in it. It's got vitamin A and C and phosphorus and potassium and iron. And even antiviral stuff properties, particularly been used historically for respiratory issues. It's been written about as far back as 400 BC. Hippocrates described the plant as his quote unquote medicine chest because it could do just basically anything. However, when I was trying to like actually cite that quote, there doesn't seem to be any proof that he ever actually said that. It's like one of those things people picked up and were like, yeah, he said this because he still believed in using the plant for a lot of stuff, but that actual quote doesn't actually seem to exist. So I've quoted it, but it's not a real quote. Fun facts with Andy.
More fake news. Seriously, dude.
Call us Fox the way we make this news up.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah.
Matt just just shaking his head at me. Anyways, so when he was writing about quote unquote writing about the elderberry, he was calling it the elder tree because for him the more important thing were the leaves of the plant that he used. So it wasn't the elderberry, it was the elder tree.
Okay, so is this what spurred that introduction?
I mean, it feels wrong, right? Like, am I wrong?
No, but you're not right either.
I mean, that's kind of like the best kind of right.
Not right,
More importantly, not wrong.
of course.
While academic research has focused on the fruit of the European elderberry, Health Canada, the agency responsible for regulating medical claims on dietary supplements, yeah, I don't know what that's like. I live in America. They use both species interchangeably for medicinal purposes or medical purposes.
So like generics, they might not be the same, but like close enough.
Or so they say. And now, I don't know if you remember this. I know you're pretty young, Matt. COVID-19, does it ring a bell? Were you still
No,
too young for
I
that?
think we learned about that in school. Yeah.
Okay. So this was kind of the catalyst for the elderberry in particular because it was like, hey, here's a natural alternative when there were shortages of the antiviral drug Tamiflu. And people were like, oh, this plant, I remember that.
Man, that like early 2020, early COVID times when everyone just no one knew what the fuck they were talking about.
Good times.
You'll we'll never, well, maybe, but
I mean, you were a toddler, so I
what a
mean,
golden age of just yapping, you know? Like, are we really good?
po-
Are we gonna get that again?
fucking everyone had a podcast.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Everyone had a podcast.
That's what I've been saying. I've always said that.
Unlike the tree-like European elderberry, the American is a bushier bush, you could call it, with really shallow mat-like roots, and it's pretty diverse in what it can handle, including consistently wet soils, while also thriving in like well-drained soils. So it can kind of do a little bit of everything.
Get you a berry that can do both, folks.
Yeah, get you a berry that can do both, and America is here for you in the form of the elderberry. Despite that, despite all of its great traits that it has, it is much less commonly sold to the general public, despite being better and more diverse conditions, being smaller so it doesn't become too unwieldy, handling cooler temperatures. Despite being better in every way, like most American things, it has been ignored. That is just only a subtle joke. The primary benefit why people tend to still like the European, despite the fact that the American is superior in just about every other way, is that it does have bigger, sweeter, more flavorful berries.
I mean,
That's all.
can we breed that? Like, is that something that can be worked on?
We could talk about it. You want to talk about it?
Fantastic. Hit me with it, Andy.
But first, we're going to talk about its historical use.
The old bait and switch. The bait and switch.
Yeah, I got to get into it. So let's talk about North America. It's a continent, and these plants lived on it, the American ones, right? Basically, across the entire continent, the American elderberry was like a very important central plant. There are indigenous stories where it's the plant that's present at the beginning of history. And that's on the West Coast. So we've been talking about it like it's on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, it was part of the beginning of history. The Iroquois included it in many of their stories. So it's like across the entire continent, this plant has been kind of central to all of communities that have lived in North America.
I feel like basically every species we talk about is like a crucial plant for indigenous people that's like revered.
I mean, maybe we could just revere more plants, and it's not them that has too many, it's us that has too few.
Run with that.
Think about it. The big noggin thought right there.
Big noggin thought.
Yeah. Seriously, though, it does point to the fact that like contextualizing and then like personifying plants as part of a greater living landscape, as opposed to like this like thing that like makes a pretty mosaic, right, in the background, allows us to have this deeper reverence that we don't really have. And part of that is that like we don't know where our food comes from, really, right? Like if you were to ask the average person what makes up most of your diet, they'd probably say like cereal or bread or like chicken. It's partly true, but it's also like a lot more complicated than that. And also, like most people, despite the fact that 50% of their diet have very likely never seen a living grain like for food, right? Like how many people have seen like wheat growing unless you live on a farm?
Yeah. We talk about like our diet being monocrops, but that's kind of a lot harder than you'd expect.
It is. And also, we're so separated from our food system that we don't ever see it. We don't understand the context of which our food comes from, or even place it within like a greater historical context, right? So, like these stories tie these plants to long histories. It's not just about this reciprocal relationship that you individually have with them, but also their relationship to your ancestors, right?
Hmm.
People always talk about like, oh, in my culture, food is important. Well, yeah, food's important in everyone's culture because that's how we relate and translate the world around us into our bodies to continue existing. And that also has like a historical precedent to it.
Yeah. And I think that's part of, I don't know what you'd call it, this idea that like what we have right now has, we don't recognize the context in which we exist and all that came before us. Is really the thought that it kind of boils down
Thank
to.
you. Thank you for showing up on November 4th. Better late than never, baby.
I think you're exactly right that like without that there's a lot of like context lacking in the like very intentional separation of us from how our food gets produced.
Yeah, and then the historical context of which that food was produced, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That we don't have any relations to why we think my family's Italian and it's like okay these are the meals we have on Christmas and I can share that with other people and especially other descendants of Italians, but that relationship to why we do certain things is very different. For them it's because my grandparents did this or whatever, whereas for me that is a part of it, but also it's within the context of what my grandparents and parents did in Italy and how those foods relate to their work. That adds like a deeper layer of complexity that is slowly stripped away when we don't keep those narratives alive, right? Where it
Hmm.
becomes tied to a specific person, not an ancestral, this is what our people have done and why they do it or continue doing it. There's a really interesting book kind of on this subject from Leslie Marmon Silko called Ceremony. And it's about this idea of how does culture continue on, right? When you've kind of cleaved that lineage, how do you reclaim that connection to history through food and culture and all these different facets? And I think that's something that we're all really grasping at. And that's why like a lot of like the locavore thing is really kind of taken off. Isn't because we necessarily think that local food is better for us because like the fertilizers going into that farm are the same ones going to the farm in California, but because it helps us like put some place in our foodways and the way that we desire for a sense of belonging. It gives us kind of like an easy out without actually addressing like those systemic issues.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think a lot of a century ago, and I mean, it was pretty common this idea that, like, processed foods were sort of cleaner, more hygienic, and like better for you. And a lot of that, like, not that it wasn't being erased before that, but a lot of these traditions are kind of like subsumed by like a market culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think it becomes pretty obvious when many people won't eat like an apple that has like a bad spot on it, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
If you fundamentally understand that it's not bad for you, then why does it bother you? It's not a criticism. It like speaks to how good that propaganda is, right? That it can get you to think that these things are bad for you or unsafe or dangerous, that picking an apple with rust on it is going to like cause you sickness, even though like that's what all fruit in the wild looked like until it still does. Unless you're buying fruit from a farm, chances are wild apples, pippins are going to have some interesting stuff growing on them. Not every single one, but that's just like a part of like nature, right? Like things don't sit out in nature perfectly waxed and clean. That's life.
Right. And that's so much that like the simple just like disconnection from farming, but also just like activities that where you're like foraging, you have
Mm.
like wild foods as part of your diet. If the food that you know or that you grow up with or the children around you are growing up with comes entirely from the grocery store, that's the alternate vision. Oh, maybe that's a bit lofty, but like, you know, the alternate that just like things look different when you see them growing, that doesn't get taught until later.
Yeah, I mean I take my kids out berry picking and things like that.
Hmm.
And I remember when my daughter was maybe 5 or so, and I think it was the first time I took her blueberry picking. And she was like so hesitant at first. And like I had to pick a few and eat them myself before she would try them. And then she thought it was like the most miraculous thing in the world
Hmm.
that like you can just like pick the things off the ground or like off the plant and eat them was just like mind blowing. Especially because it wasn't even like, oh, this is our garden in the backyard. It's just like, no, we're on a hike and there's these blueberries and we're gonna eat them. And there's some huckleberries and they're very similar and you can eat those too. And like kind of like opening up this world to them is really like it's unmatched. And I really hope more people try to engage with it.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And I think one of the most, I don't know what the word would be like, kind of vicious parts of this cultural loss that we've been talking about is how quickly it compounds from generation to generation. You know,
Yeah.
your kids have that experience because you are deeply interested in foraging and wild foods, but there are plenty of people with kids that really have no interest in that. And so, in a matter of a generation or, two generations, these really essential skills or outlooks on your food or celebration and tradition really can go in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, and part of that also is even like ourselves as adults who like rationally understand these things to still like psychologically overcome them. That like I rationally understand that this fruit is okay to eat because it has XYZ, but I'm still like unnerved by it and like getting over that so that your children or the next generation or those around you don't inherit those same concerns or let those concerns compound on their own concerns that they've also been propagandized into, right? And that can be its layers of challenges that make this really difficult to like re-engage with the landscape around us. But I think to the point that we're trying to make, that we have to have these relationships, and that was why we keep seeing this narrative come up of every plant is unique, every plant is special, every fruit is unique, every nut is special, and that they have a very deep, complex, and important mutualistic relationship with humans and the rest of the landscape.
Mhm.
So, like the Yakuts, in also, for example, they used the elderberry harvest to announce like the sugar pine nut harvests, and the coastal Pomo tracked shellfish gathering by the flowering and ripening of the elderberry. So, like, not only were the plants important for themselves as food, but also to mark when to harvest other things, the same way like we have a seasonal clock, which I know we've talked about in the past. The elderberry were managed very similar to like blueberries. They used controlled burns, which removed a lot of competitive plants, reduced pest pressure, kept the canopy clear. And it also was really important because with the American elderberry, you've got these canes, almost like a blackberry almost. So you only want to keep a handful of those canes and not the very old ones. So doing these occasional burns helps clear a lot of that older stuff out. And obviously the fruit were used for food. They were also used as dye. The flowers were used, as I'm sure most people are familiar with, elderberry flower syrups and things like that. Well, what I found interesting was that a lot of the berries were processed by drying on mats in the sun to store. So we talked about like blueberries being stored through the winter. And it seems like from what I was reading, that elderberry has been historically stored in very similar ways. I didn't see any specifics to the mixing it with maple syrup we had talked about, which sounded phenomenal, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was something done someplace. And like I said, the leaves were also used very similarly to Europe as various like tonics and poultices, and they used the leaves to make like an eye water. And again, just very, very common across the globe.
Okay, but from what you said, it sounds like there's sort of a more prominent use on the West Coast.
Yeah, so I did point to mostly West Coast examples. And part of this is because on the East Coast, a lot of, not all, but a lot of history was erased because of earlier colonization. But given how universal the usage was, the fact that we saw it similarly in present day California as Europe, it's hard to believe that the space in between that also had the same plant didn't use it somewhat similarly. And what's interesting too is that wild elderberry was important symbolically as a medicinal plant. It also was, according to archaeological sites, prominent as a food source. So, like in terms of like the residues left on sites, they in some cases made up as much of the material left over as acorn nutshells, which, yeah, that's a pretty big deal to me.
I mean, we've talked about, acorns being like a pretty big deal food-wise for a long, long time.
Exactly. So if it was, we keep saying every plant's significant, but the fact that there's that much residue being left behind from the seeds of elderberries means that like it was important. We talked about the acorn being like this very important wild food for survival, and elderberry is right up there with it. And of course, this isn't a direct correlation, but it does point out that the elderberry was like a very special plant. And in those archaeological sites, what I also found interesting was that the seeds were charred, which highlights the fact that processing was a part of how the fruit was used, meaning that they were harvesting enough that they had fruit to process, right? Like that there was leftovers that they could store.
The big question we ask with every new plant, Andy, does it nixtamalize?
So we don't actually know. But we do know they were getting cooked. We know they were getting cooked in the same spot as acorns, and we know they were nixtamalizing acorns. So I would say, if you, gun to my head, yes. Do we have the evidence? No. They were processing them and cooking them over direct fire, and given again that they used to cook in ash like persimmon and pawpaw. I know we haven't talked about persimmon yet, but it tracks. So, for context, the fruit of the European elderberry is rarely consumed raw. The seeds, like many fruits, contain cyanide-inducing glycoside. However, however, dropping a bomb on y'all, the University of Missouri found that the ripe American elderberry cultivars, berries, and seeds contained little to no glycosides, unlike the European varieties.
I mean, is it a pretty safe bet that indigenous people also consume them raw?
While it's not explicit anywhere, it does seem to be like implied that was the case.
Okay, because then maybe the Canadian health people we were talking about earlier are kind of full of shit because that sounds like a pretty significant difference.
I mean, that shouldn't be a total shock. Like, I can understand why they would be like, listen, you can eat this one, but not this one that looks exactly the same. And also, we know you're not going to do any research on this, so you're going to say we told you you could eat them and you can't eat them. So I'll give them a pass on this one. Like, I would probably do the same thing in their shoes. Now, that said, I wouldn't really suggest fully like going out and eating them, right? Part of it is that there can be crosses and it's fairly common. And of course, I'm only referring to one study. Traditionally, cooking the berries over 180 degrees or through fermentation typically is the process used to break down and deactivate those glycosides. And all that does is basically make the fruit edible.
So just cook it.
There you go. Now, the elderberry hasn't really gained a whole lot of traction in the US. especially the American, because again, it's not quite as delicious and the fruits are smaller. Doesn't mean they're bad, they're just not as good. And we are going to get there. So there doesn't seem to be much of a history or storyline like the other crops we've covered when it comes to like generations of breeders, where it's like, oh, these people in the 19th century did this thing, and then the 20th century did this. Doesn't seem to really exist when it comes to Americans. So in that sense, it's kind of a boring story.
Man, it sounds like you just couldn't hack the research,
If I did miss something, dear listeners,
dear listener.
please let me know. I would love to know more and be told that I am a big dumb idiot that can't do research.
And listeners, we are sitting by the phone right now waiting for that call. Please call in, listeners.
Call on 1-800 poor parole.
Yeah, please hit the hotline.
Dom, if you can throw like a ringing number in the background or something, that'd be great.
And maybe a kooky sound effect or two.
No pressure though.
Swing, bong.
When you put it that way, okay. So, in recent memory, one of the most significant breeders for elderberry was this guy named Lewis Hill. He was a Vermont horticulturalist responsible for not only two of American elderberry cultivars, one's called Coomer and Berry Hill, but also for two black currant cultivars and 9 registered daylilies.
Man, another banger out of Vermont.
You only get the best up there. Given that he was in Vermont, it shouldn't be surprised that a good chunk of the American elderberry breeding comes from the Northeast. And that breeding work is incredibly limited, as I've hinted at to this point. The other area of research is Missouri, because for some reason, the only places in this country where research in plants is being done is Missouri, Kentucky, and New Jersey. I could not tell you why, but that just seems to be the places where this stuff is done. And we've talked about Missouri because they also have a really great black walnut program. Go listen to us meander about other plants. We'll bring up Missouri a lot.
I mean, it does seem like a handful of programs carry a bunch of the research that we've like been talking about. What, like UPenn, Rutgers,
Forgot
Missouri,
them.
Cornell, and
Cornell's another one.
Kentucky. I feel like are they doing, I mean, most of the grunt work.
Yeah, I don't know why. We're really phoning it in over here in New England. I don't know what's going on.
They're not interested in it.
No, I guess. So in Missouri, there have been several cultivars that have been developed as well, including Bob Gordon. Bob is a relatively new cultivar that offers several benefits. It's got large berries, large yields, and very big clusters that hang upside down, which helps protect the berries from birds.
Well, that's a pretty cool trait.
I mean, if we could get more plants to just like flop over,
Hmm.
like blueberries, so that they can't get eaten by birds, that'd be fucking great.
Yeah. Can't really think of any other fruits that do that. They just kind of like
Because they don't.
fold in and protect themselves. I guess corn in a way. You know what I'm talking about?
No.
It's got a, well, I guess lots of, never mind.
Okay.
I guess I'm just thinking of a peel is what I'm
You're
thinking
trying,
about.
yeah, you're trying real
I guess
hard.
I'm just thinking about like the two layers that most fruit have.
Yeah, no. There are some other varieties. I'm not going to go into them. You can read about it on our Substack. But the point is that they are producing a bunch of plants and they're producing some, hopefully, pretty promising stuff so that we can like get Americans back on the landscape. Make America great again, baby.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Make it,
There it is.
but only with elderberries.
Yeah, everything else, no, but elderberries, we're doing it.
Well,
Persimmons too. We haven't gotten there, but we're gonna.
make America covered with native elderberries again. Macwiniba.
Now, typically, elderberry bushes will send up new canes, as I hinted before, or primary branches each year. It typically takes about 5 years or more for your bushes to reach full height. The best yield is usually on the second year canes with lateral branches. So, like, very similar to a lot of blackberries, I believe. Blackberries are second year canes, or is it raspberries? I can never remember. I hate the pointy ones. I just let them go feral.
Well, the pointy ones, the more pointy ones are definitely the blackberries.
No, I mean they're both pointy in different ways. Like one's pointy like a horse chestnut, and the other one's pointy like an American chestnut.
True.
Isn't that great? I love that I could say that and you knew what I meant.
Yeah. I'm there with you.
So the best yield is usually on the second year canes with lateral branches. However, as the number of lateral branches with clusters increases, the size of the cluster will shrink if the bushes are not pruned. So that means now you're doing more work, more clusters, less fruit on each cluster. Now, new plants don't need pruning, and only after the second season should plants even be pruned. And that's like during the late winter when you're typically kind of doing all of your cleanup work, right? Canes that are over 3 years should be removed. And as I was saying before, you don't want to have a ton of canes. Specifically, try to stay under 10, and that'll keep you from like getting old stuff out, trying to reduce pest pressure, disease pressure, sending energy into stuff that's not going to produce fruit, all that important stuff. One of the challenges of elderberry in terms of like harvesting it from a number of perspectives is that the newer canes tend to produce fruit earlier than the older canes, meaning that you don't just get to go and harvest the plant, you got to do it several times, which is not totally uncommon when it comes to plants like blackberries and stuff. It can become a bit time consuming. Now, the problem with elderberries, it's similar to some other thinner skinned fruits, is that the berries can begin to deteriorate pretty quickly after harvesting. For elderberries, it's super quick. It's about 2 to 4 hours before you already start to see that it is in pretty tough shape and it needs to be in the fridge within a couple hours.
So the fruit needs to be processed a couple of times a season. I can see that being a problem because like who wants to do this stuff? I mean, it's like way easier to just set it up once and be done with it.
Exactly. It can be a bit of a hassle. Now, growers today estimate that you can hand harvest roughly 22 pounds an hour, which for those that have been blueberry picking, that is great. That is great timing. I think I could probably do like 10 an hour without like a rake. To process, the fastest and easiest method is to screen. This means to use some hardware cloth and basically rub the stems of the berry across the screen. This causes the ripe berries to loosen up, and you end up with very little of the other stuff. Doing this, well, you can process about 20 pounds in about 15 minutes, which is like fantastic, right? Now, at 340 calories a pound, this equates to roughly 6,000 calories an hour, meaning an hour's worth of work could provide a large family with a meaningful amount of fruit for caloric purposes, because obviously there's no protein and all that important stuff. But you could provide like a good amount of people with fruit for the day, like within 15 minutes. Now, while fruit calories are much easier to harvest and process than the protein rich calories of acorns or hickories or walnuts, for such a small sized fruit and on a small plant compared to others of similar size, it is still very significant.
Yeah, I mean that's like a pretty ridiculous amount of calories. I can see why it was a big deal to harvest, especially like if on top of that it also has medicinal qualities like in the fruit and other parts.
Yeah. And again, when you're talking about a fruit that has such a short shelf life, if you're going to pick it, you have to like pick it, process it. So I can see why it was like symbolically like when the fruit is ready, this is the thing you're doing because we have to do it in this window or it gets spoiled.
Hmm.
So like it has to be like the focal energy of whatever you're doing because otherwise you're just going to waste a lot of calories very quickly. So if you are looking to propagate elderberry, they are pretty easy to do. Ask anybody that's grown them. You basically can just take a hardwood cutting during the winter, make sure it's like over a foot, and stick all of it but like a couple inches into the soil. And congratulations, you now have an elderberry plant. Yay!
Woo.
So it's important to keep the cuttings cool, keep them out of sunlight if you're traveling with them. Make sure they're moist until they're ready to be rooted, but not soaking. So like a soggy newspaper is or paper towels is really great. And then get them into that soil, right? Now, as the plants get bigger, they're going to send out runners, which also can be cut off and replanted.
I mean, truly an unstoppable native bush crop. I'm sold. Call me elder pilled.
Okay, call me dad.
Nope.
No. Uh,
Call
yeah, that sounds about right. It's a cool plant.
elder maxing,
Elder maxing, berry maxing.
berry maxing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a cool plant. I'm pumped about it. I'm more interested than ever in growing the American elderberry. I've got some going, but they're not selections. But now I want to get my hands on some selections. There are about a dozen or so selections that I'm aware of. So like they're out there. And to the point that I feel like we make a lot during the season or talking about American native crops, there's a lot of room to go in terms of like breeding. And you could be that person. Like there's somebody's got to do it. And you could make your mark on agriculture by finding a really cool selection.
Well, maybe we're talking to that person already.
Maybe we are. Maybe it's Matt.
We well,
This is going to be
I,
his turning moment
I was gonna say
50 years from
we
now.
don't know how many people from the Missouri agroforestry department listen to our podcast. It could be all of
Like, that's
them.
true. It's
Probably
probably all of
none of
them.
them.
It's
Right.
probably being blasted in the greenhouse where they're doing all their propagation work.
Yeah.
If I've learned anything from this podcast,
I'm sure our voices is what they want to be hearing when they do a really, really dull task.
it is. That's what everyone tells me. Like those monotones,
Mm-hmm.
they hit
Just
different.
nothing but flat, folks. That's how you host a podcast.
It is.
Nothing but flat.
Yeah. So if you want to read more about this, you can go check out our pod. No, we are on the podcast. If you want to read more about this, you can check out our Substack, agroecologies.org, where we've got all the sources for this bad boy, as well as some of those details about the cultivars that do exist and some of their traits. So if you want to know which Americans to buy based on what you want, that is a good place to start. Next week, we've got a very exciting guest to
Yeah.
talk about elderberries. And if you just cannot wait to listen to that interview, you can go to patreon.com/Poor Pro's Almanac. And for a whopping 16 cents a day, you can listen to this episode with no commercials, all of the fun, and maybe get stuff early.
Sold, Andy. Sold.
Maybe. I'm not very good about that, but we try. We try real hard.
Sign me up.
Signing Matt up now, taking all of his money.
I'll send you the Venmo.
There we go. That's the spirit. Also, go buy our stickers because I keep forgetting if we don't ever tell people that we have these things, then they're not going to buy them. But if you go to poorproles.com, we do have stuff for sale like hats and stickers and patches. And I think that's it. But we have those three things. Shirts are too expensive.
Oh, I was kind of hoping that they'd just sort of intuit it naturally. Or like maybe it would come to them in a dream.
Yeah.
Or maybe it would be foretold to them.
I mean, I've been working on the dream thing. It just doesn't seem to be working. We are the prophecy and we are foretelling them.
I feel yeah, there's options.
There are.
Listeners, let us
So
know
we're
if
just,
something was foretold about our merch
yes, you
for
get
you.
a special discount for the
Yeah.
foretold audience. It's the number 4
hmm
and then Todaso, TOADASO.
Boom.
A Todaso.
Try that out, listeners.
Thank you all.
It definitely works.